Thanks for having me again over here. It's always a pleasure to be in Buckingham. My question is, possible externalities, are they really there? The background here is that part of the Chicago School's legacy is the focus on human capital. It's not their word. As far as I know, Irving Fisher was the first to talk about human capital, so education as a form of capital. It was developed by people like Theodor Schultz or Jacob Minzer in the couple of years he was in Chicago. Minzer was associated with the Chicago for the rest of his life. And this idea that education is actually a form of capital like other forms of capital that will give you a stream of benefits. Later on, as I said, Schultz is the first also to think of this as a production function in a normal macro sense. Gary Becker developed that. And all of that discussion is really whether, to what extent, education of human capital contributes to private personal income. However, there is a second Chicago School here that we usually don't think of as Chicago School. But at the late 1980s, people like Robert Lucas and Paul Romer revived the study of economic growth and revived, in particular, the kind of family of models that we call endogenous growth models. And at the time, both were in Chicago. So Lucas proposed that changes in education will give you faster growth. Romer got his Nobel Prize for the idea that the stock of human capital contributes to innovation that drives economic growth in the long run. So there is actually a Chicago School that has contributed massively to the study of economic growth and also productivity growth for years on end, and resulted in one Nobel Prize. And if Lucas hadn't gotten his prize for something else, he would probably also have shared that prize for growth theory. Now, a lot of that is based on thinking about how education works and which kind of role it plays in modern society, but it's not just modern. So going back, the historical approaches here to education, to the idea that education is not just something that you take for your own pleasure or your own benefit, but there might be something more. Is, for example, in Prussia, that the story of the Prussian Generallandschulreglement, sorry about if that's in Germany, is well known. It's the idea that the Prussian state under Frederick the Great, I think, issued a law that pushed municipalities to fund schools for children between 5 to 13 and perhaps 14. However, a lot of historians claim that it was not for the betterment of the Prussian population. It was actually part of a broader set of policies to foster obedience in Prussia. So it had at least partially a military purpose. This is the time when Prussia becomes an actual military power. But there are very different approaches across Europe. In Southern Europe, it's usually a church responsibility. It's the Catholic Church that delivers education, either through the church organization per se, or single priests in villages and towns. In Denmark, the story is similar in Norway, because Norway was part of Denmark at that time. That was interesting. The story is usually that
The team's going next. Yes.
Disco time.
Is it the lap of the
It's the Russians.
It's not me.
Anyway, Denmark Norway's story is that usually that the king sets up what's called rider schools from between 1721 and 27. the entire system has changed by 1814. But those schools are there to supplement hundreds of community-backed schools that are already there. So the normal thing in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden was that the community actually provided a teacher. You have economies of scale, obviously. It's much, much cheaper per person to teach 20 kids as one kid, and that's what communities did. Even very small communities typically had a teacher. Sometimes it was a local vicar, sometimes it wasn't. And the Danish public policy simply aimed at supplementing that in the few places that there wasn't a municipal school. And a funny part of that is that Denmark at that time consisted of the kingdom, Denmark and Norway, and the double Dutch Schleswig-Holstein, which is the bit of what's now Germany down to Hamburg. When you get to 1850, we have very good measures of literacy, and there's no difference between the duchies and the kingdom. Essentially, the public policy here seems not to have made a lasting difference because the communities in Scandinavia already provided proper education. But once we then move on, the idea becomes that this is something that the state should do. And a lot of the discussion here is really based on the Prussian experience. That Prussia created these, what was eventually state schools. Becomes important in France in the 19th century. It becomes important in parts, not all, but parts of the US. And well, in UK, who knows? That in mid 19th century development towards more public schooling. Now, a lot of this conceptual work here comes out of the Chicago School. The idea here that you might have to fund education, at least. The Prussians run the schools themselves. Other places, the state simply funds it, but the community runs it. There are good and bad justifications here. The good justifications for the state funding this is that there is some kind of market failure. That basically either you have major problems like credit constraints that provide parts of the population from sending their kids to school, or the other one is that there is a positive externality. That part of the benefits of education are not only enjoyed by the person who gets education, but that there are broader benefits to society as a whole. And of course, if there are market failures, well, you can argue for state funding. The bad ones, pure redistribution. That we just, for some reason, want someone to have education and or we just redistribute from someone else. Second is vote and rent seeking. That you actually, and we have examples of that you expand public schooling because, well, people will vote for you. That happens in Scandinavia, for example, in the 1960s when ordinary middle class families start sending their kids to university. And within a decade, you have state funding for people going to university. They get a public subsidy. The externalities haven't changed, but the voter base has. And you can actually also get rent seeking from, for example, teachers' unions. That's a major issue in the US. That you get more funding because teachers' unions would just like more money. And the last one is, well, that's a Prussian one. It's a justification for bringing education under government control. So the government decides what kids learn. In Prussia, that was obedience. In the Soviet Union, that would be to be a proper communist. But you can argue for all sorts of things here, and there's an ongoing discussion of whether there should be quote unquote political control with what kids are taught. But remember here again, a lot of this work comes out of the Chicago School, including the idea that there are positive externalities. But you have to have positive externalities before you have a decent argument for state funding at a broad level. So the personal benefits are well known. Right? Higher education produces either skills or knowledge or signaling. I'm going to come back to that in a bit. It might actually lead to a healthier lifestyle. If you think that having a healthier population entails positive externalities, well, you can argue for that. It might actually provide entry into politics in some countries. Some people say, well, there's a personal benefit in getting education because you're going to have a larger partner choice. More people are just going to be interested in marrying you. All of those benefits are individual. So the question is, why would you subsidize education if it's not purely redistributive or voter rent-seeking? And in particular, and this is Brian Kaplan's argument, a lot of the association between education and income, the fact that better educated people earn more money, is simply because the education is a signal that you already have better skills, more knowledge, whatever. So you go to university simply to show that you're smart, and you're earning more money because you're smart, not because you learned anything at university. So if this is all signaling, then there can't be any positive externalities, because the same people would be just as smart without education. So why would we then subsidize education? There's a big debate of how much is actual knowledge and how much is just signaling. So the Chicago School's main contribution here is essentially, okay, when we think about subsidized education, we need to make that argument for some kinds of externalities, some kinds of broader benefits to society. What are those? Well, the claims here are that you have, this is McMahon's definition of what we're talking about, benefit to others in society and to future generations, not private benefits to individuals educated. And the problem, of course, is if they exist and we just have a purely private system, we're going to underinvest in education. The claims here are, first of all, you get more productive if you're more educated, and that spills over to your colleagues. They get more productive because you're more productive, either because what you're doing is complementary to what they're doing, or that they learn from you, or, and that's the new argument from growth theory, that more educated people are in some way either more innovative, they push our knowledge frontier, or they are better at implementing innovation from somewhere else, which will also benefit not just them, but also the firm that they're employed by. Another argument is that, and this is all the way back to the same with Martin Lipset, is, well, they make better political choices. You can argue in favor of that. You can also think this is just utterly stupid. But the argument that the claim is there, a more educated population will make better political choices. There's also a lot of work, in particular in sociology, on the likelihood of democratization. That actually a more educated society will be more likely to introduce democracy and maintain democracy as a stable political institution. Some of the more advanced arguments here is that you need an educated population in order to have a free press. Gary Becker was one of the people who suggested that perhaps you're going to get less crime. Because, first of all, educated people have better options than stealing and murdering people. And secondly, that educated people are more likely to realize the downside of crime. And lastly, there is an argument that some people think of this as a positive externality, that you get a more educated population, it's more productive, they're going to earn more money, and therefore they're going to pay more taxes. And that's then counted as a positive externality. Some of us would probably see that as a negative externality. But again, note that whether or not the more taxes argument is to be counted as a positive externality depends fundamentally on what does the government do with the resources. Yeah. Now, the big problem now is how to assess whether those claims are true or not. There's a lot of research done essentially since the 1960s on whether those benefits are there or not. There are a number of problems here. A first problem is the personal benefits of education are static. You're going to be better educated, you're going to have a higher income. And your income or benefits, your knowledge, your skills, whatever, might spill over to other people who are going to be more productive. And that's it. However, the argument here for some of these externalities are dynamic. That's Lucas's and Romer's argument, theoretically, that more education in society will lead to more innovation and therefore faster growth. So how do we assess that? Because one argument is about the income level, the other one is about income growth. They're not compatible, but people still make the argument that, there must be positive externality because we observe growth. There's no national comparison to make here. Second one, the measurement problem is, and if you read the literature, you get the, that's not what I meant problem. That some people find no effects of education, and then what they conclude is that, our educational measure is just bad. It's not there, it's there. We just didn't measure it because we're measuring education in the wrong way. Right? Those of you who are active researchers know what I'm talking about. And you have the causality problem. Societies with high incomes, first of all, it's easier to fund education if you're richer. Secondly, higher income countries tend to have better institutions. A practical problem in Ukraine before the war was that education didn't really mean anything because you could bribe your way to the right papers. That's how bad institutions undermine education. With good institutions, you're actually going to get the education that your paper says that you have. So there are huge problems here, first of all, of just documented whether or not those positive externalities are there. And very often, perhaps not researchers, but those who use research end up arguing that, we find an association between education and income. Richer countries are better educated, so there must be positive externalities. We can better society by throwing more money after education. And perhaps we can, but that's not evidence for those positive externalities. it's also not evidence that, well, you get more growth if you have more education. You might see the correlation there. It's still not evidence that what's actually driving this is education. It might just be that society gets better institutions lead to more education, and better institutions lead to growth. So it's not causal. But policymakers for years, including the World Bank, have been very keen to conclude that education is really important for long-run development. And the more you look into the literature, the more you realize that that's really not what the empirical literature actually shows. So there's a beautiful paper from 1999 by Land Pritchard. Pritchard was then at the World Bank, and it's called "Where Did All the Education Go?" Because he does a very, very thorough job of looking at the association between education and long-run economic growth, and he can't find it. And the problem is, if he can't find it, Robert Barrow, who more or less founded the empirical study of growth and education, didn't find it either. Many papers that struggle to find any effect of education. If you find that zero, you've basically rejected that a lot of these dynamic positive externalities are there. And then you're undermining the political case for subsidizing education. Then you're down to saying, well, we might do this because it is nice, but it's not because we have any economic reason to actually subsidize education. So let me just show you a bit of evidence myself. So what I did the other day, I should apologize. I wanted to have a paper for this event. I have a presentation. The paper will be written, but it'll probably be written the day that Niklas thinks, no, we should probably work on something else with our joint project. It's not your fault. So basically, what I've done here is follow a logic that we follow in another forthcoming paper, where we look at when do societies become much more educated. So we look at these jumps in education, which basically when you get a more educated generation entering the labor market. If you have these positive externalities, you should see changes when an entire generation that's better educated than parents moves into the labor market. And we then look at what happens to those countries relative to other countries that look similar but don't have a new generation with more education moving in. So it's a matching estimate. But it's based just looking at very comparable countries where one of those countries sees this jump in education and the others that have the same basic situation do not. Just focus on the top. So these are effects on GDP growth. It's positive, but it's very, very far from being statistically significant, the first one. LP, that's labor productivity growth. LH, that's labor, that's how much. That's a good productivity measure because that's how fast the economy is growing in terms of production per work hour. There's just nothing there. If you look at democracy, and this is assessing from 1970 on, the effect on the likelihood of democratization when you get a more educated population, it's negative. Essentially, when you see these positive changes in education, the next generation is less likely to democratize than your parents. So if we're following the logic here, That's a negative externality of education. And finally, EFW, that is the Economic Freedom of the World Index, which is very broadly a measure of the quality of the policy framework. There's nothing there. The bottom line is simply to show you that it's not the method. Because the bottom line is what happens if you get these jumps in policy quality. They affect growth no matter how we measure it. They don't really affect the likelihood of demonstration. But it's not that we can't find anything with the method. It's simply that if you really try to do these things carefully, your argument for positive externalities of education just falls by the wayside. It's not necessarily that they're not there, but they're not systematically there. And that they're so uncertain that we actually can't find anything with methods that really very clearly show effects of other stuff that we usually talk about. So what's the problem here? Well, should the state be involved in funding anything if it doesn't do anything? You could also ask yourself, well, is this just completely stupid to do? What if this is like Scandinavia? Civil society handled the problems historically. Broadly speaking, if you have these externalities, you can't just say, oh, there's an externality, the state should do something. If civil society does it anyhow, you don't have an argument for state intervention. And broadly speaking, you can think of this as just civil society moving in and fixing the problems if there is an education problem. How do you know that? Again, if we're trying to subsidize education, how do we know the future demand for education? And how do we know what kind of education there's a demand for in the future? So this is very often the political argument for subsidized education is, oh, it's for future generations. But there's no way we can know exactly what is demanded by future firms or future NGOs or whatever. What kinds of education are demanded? And we're back again to Frank Knight, one of the founders of the Chicago School, who would have said that this is actually what we now call Knightian uncertainty. We can't know what's demanded in the future. And there's no way we can get to know it. And the last thing is, well, are we sure that those externalities that people have claimed based on historical evidence are still there? Or has modern society just fixed that? So my whole point here is essentially that we very often take this for granted. Education is good. And therefore, we have to get some level of state intervention, because otherwise we're not getting enough education. If you look at both the theoretical arguments and very often the empirical evidence, that case is very, very weak. And no one really in the original Chicago School made that argument, but what I call the second Chicago School with Lucas and Roma and those guys actually do. And seems as if the first Chicago School had it right, but the second Chicago School is just overselling the argument.